Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to another episode of the Falcoholic Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Knight at Falcoholic Kevin, here to bring you another episode in our Falcons roster review series, taking a look at who the Falcons have under contract, who the Falcons have hitting free agency, and who some top free agent targets are at every position on the roster. And today's focus is going to be running back. If you're interested in some of the other offensive positions, we did quarterback last week, and we had wide receiver earlier in the week as well. So you can go back and listen to those. Those are all on the feed as well. But welcome in today. Like I said, going to be focusing on running back. And it's an interesting one, right? Because the Falcons actually had a ton of production from this group. They were one of the NFL's best, maybe the NFL's best rushing attack, depending on some metrics. Had a really electric performance from a rookie running back, had a really good performance from a former UDFA running back, and then of course Cordarrelle Patterson is here as well. So lots to like there, but a position that might sort of be a sneaky need in free agency or, in the draft, and we'll get into the reasons for that soon. Before we do that, did want to give you guys an update on the podcast because, like I said previously, we might have needed to change the name here towards the end of the month, but that is going to be delayed. It was just communicated to me actually today, for listening to this on Friday, that this merge will not be happening in March at all. It'll actually be happening April 1st. So no changes whatsoever to the podcast for another month, so everyone can relax a little bit. No matter what, the podcast feed will remain the same. The name might change, but if you're subscribed to the pod, if you're on our YouTube channel, no matter what platform you're on, everything will remain the same in terms of the feed. You'll just maybe see a slightly different name for those things when the dust clears. But for now, one more month, nothing's happening, so everything's fine, I guess. So just relax. That does also mean I'm being paid for one more month, so that's also nice. So hey, not going to complain there. But anyway, getting back to the Falcons-centric part of this conversation, the running back group is an interesting one, and we're going to go ahead and kick things off by looking at the running backs that the Falcons have under contract. So right now, at the top of the list, of course, is Cordarrelle Patterson, who's making a pretty healthy $5.5 million this year. And it's not a contract where the Falcons are able to save a ton of money with a cut. And Cordarrelle Patterson's value, even though he's not going to be nearly as high a volume player as he was in his first year here, is still high. Patterson's clearly a great red zone threat. I think he's likely to be utilized more and more as a receiving threat. And when he is healthy, I mean, there's no doubt that Patterson's a dynamic presence back there in the running back group. And for other reasons, that we'll get to further down the depth chart, I think keeping Patterson around is even more important because there's not necessarily the depth here that we might have originally hoped for based on what we saw in 2022. Next guy on the list, making just a whopping $1 million, is return specialist Avery Williams. Did play a little bit at running back, about 13% of the snaps, was utilized as a receiver. It's clearly something that he's still sort of adjusting to, but I wouldn't rule out Avery Williams taking on a bigger role going forward. The team clearly likes him. He was one of the best punt returners in the NFL. I believe he had the highest punt return average of any returner this year. So clearly a guy that they like. He has that sort of emergency ability to play corner as well. So a versatile sort of back end of the roster guy. How much value does he actually give you as a running back? That's sort of an open question still. He was certainly not a bad player in that regard. I think Williams certainly showed off some good hands. We know that he's good with the ball as well, but just 22 carries for 109 yards. He did average over exactly 5 yards a carry, so that's pretty efficient. And he had the touchdown. 13 catches for 61 yards for pretty pedestrian 4.7 yards per carry. So still a role that he's adjusting to. Not really sure that we're going to necessarily ever see a whole lot there, but I'm not going to rule it out based on his first year at that position since playing it in high school. So there could be more upside there for Williams. We'll see. The big name, of course, is Tyler Allgeier, the rookie fifth rounder who came in and basically took over the backfield at a certain point. Started kind of slow, right? But Allgeier quickly improved pretty much every single week. I mean, I was really I think early on it almost looked like Allgeier was like the least impressive of all the guys that the Falcons had, but he finished super strong, got better every single week, was much better as a receiver than expected, and ended with 210 carries for 1,035 yards, broke the Falcons' rookie rushing record that stood for a really long time. Did score only 3 rushing touchdowns, which is a little bit low considering that volume, but not anything to be concerned about. Ended up with a 4.1 yards per carry average, which is pretty incredible, and added those 16 catches for 139 yards and a touchdown as well. So Allgeier is definitely the guy right now that's likely to take the RB1 mantle, a guy that I think you can depend on to be your sort of workhorse back. The thing that Allgeier doesn't really offer is that like dynamic home run ability, and that's something we'll talk about as we go forward. He was, pretty durable. But again, running back is one of those positions where you can lose guys at any time. So I do think the Falcons have found something in Allgeier as a guy that can potentially be their starting running back going forward. But I wouldn't necessarily view the position as locked up with just Allgeier, and I think there are ways to bolster the depth around him. One of those ways would have been Caleb Huntley, who was looking great before his injury. I think Huntley was early on maybe the most impressive of the running backs not named Cordarrelle Patterson playing. Ended up getting hurt with an Achilles injury, unfortunately. Ended with just 76 carries for 366 yards and a touchdown, averaging 4.8 per carry. Huntley is really just a runner only, didn't really catch the ball, didn't really play on passing downs, but was playing really well as that sort of relief running back, that rotational guy. And with that Achilles injury, fairly late in the season, I'm not sure how soon we'll see Caleb Huntley or if we'll see him at all in 2023. So not having him as like your RB3 sort of depth guy that you can reliably give the ball to is a big loss to the depth at running back. The Falcons did also sign their practice squad running back BJ Baylor to a futures contract, so he'll be here in 2023. We never actually saw him play any snaps on offense, but that's another guy that's going to be here in camp and have a chance to potentially earn a depth spot. And they also signed fullback Clint Ratkovich to a futures contract. I think was one of the top fullbacks either in the last draft class or the class before that the Falcons were interested in, but he ended up signing elsewhere. So he's somebody to monitor going into camp, but again, a guy that's going to compete probably for that role. So those are the guys under contract. They do have a fair number of guys here, right? But is Huntley going to be able to play? How much do you trust Avery Williams? And, Cordarrelle Patterson probably needs to have his snaps managed pretty carefully, given what we've seen from him the last 2 years, slowing down at the end of the year. Going ahead to the running backs that are pending free agents, there's just one, and he's not really a running back. It's Keith Smith, the fullback, who's going to be going into his age 31 season. Smith was making about $1.4 million, so you could potentially shave a little bit of cap, like $500,000, by going to like a cheaper vet minimum fullback. But Smith has been really good in that role. He's an excellent special teamer. He does seem to have the favor of the coaching staff, so I wouldn't be shocked at all if they just re-sign Keith Smith to a similar deal. But we'll see, what they decide to do there. Not really a significant move one way or the other. I do think that given how much this team seems to prioritize getting those good special teams players, I think Smith will be back, but he may, have more significant competition for that role this year with a guy like Clint Ratkovich, who's a full-time fullback. And with Smith getting into his 30s, the Falcons are probably feeling a little bit more pressure to see if they can find a cheaper guy, find a younger guy that they can potentially have in here for, another 5 or 6 years when Smith is ready to hang him up or starts to slow down. So that's just something to consider at that group. But now we're going to move on to the potential free agent targets for Atlanta. And there's a lot of free agent running backs, just like wide receiver. There's always a lot of free agent running backs, right? And with the Falcons having the potential depth issues, given that if Allgeier's healthy, everything's fine. But running back injuries are very common in the NFL, and I don't know that Cordarrelle Patterson is a guy that can really hold up to carrying the load. So without Caleb Huntley as your backup, you've basically got Avery Williams and Cordarrelle Patterson as your two guys that are going to have to step up if Allgeier goes down. So there's certainly room for someone to sort of take on that Huntley role until Huntley is back healthy. And again, I'm not sure that that's going to happen at any point during the 2023 season. He may just be a guy that rides the IR all year, maybe late in the season, maybe midway through the season. He's healthy enough to come back. That'd be great. But I wouldn't depend on that necessarily. It's a really tough, long injury to come back from, especially for running backs. But there's a lot of names out there. Obviously the big name is Saquon Barkley. I don't really seriously think the Falcons will pursue him, but given how important the run game is to Atlanta and how well he would fit in this style of offense, he would really give them that sort of dynamic presence that they kind of lack right now. I'll put it in there. Saquon's probably asking for north of $10 million a year at running back, and I suspect that he'll get it from somebody. I don't know if it'll be the Giants or somebody else, but it's worth putting out there. I personally wouldn't go into that. I think Allgeier is good enough that you're not trying to pay a running back significant money, but it's certainly worth mentioning. Like that's the same reason I didn't put guys like David Montgomery or Josh Jacobs in here, because those are guys that are all gonna be making like 8 to 10 million per. And again, I think that's just like too much for what the Falcons are probably looking to add in free agency, which is more of a RB2 type guy that can be a sort of spot starter or that fills some sort of particular role for them behind Allgeier and Patterson. So the more interesting guys, I think, start in that sort of like 5 million and under tier. And there's quite a few of them, like a Devin Singletary from the Bills is a guy that I've always sort of liked. Again, not a super flashy guy. Sort of reminds you of Caleb Huntley probably in a lot of ways, in that he's sort of a shorter statured back, but he's thick. And Singletary has been consistently productive. He's averaged 4.7 yards per carry over his career. Had a good season last year with the Bills, right? Just under 200 carries, 819 yards, 4.6 yards per carry, and 5 touchdowns. Quality player, a guy that I would feel very comfortable with as the sort of, RB2 to Tyler Allgeier. The thing with Singletary is he doesn't really add anything that like Allgeier doesn't already bring. So he's not the type of guy that's going to bring that sort of dynamic presence, but he would sort of fill that Huntley role well. He would probably be one of the more expensive options, however, and that leads you to guys like Jamal Williams from the Lions, who we all know is just sort of a red zone monster. Never been the most efficient runner, but is sort of a volume guy, good size. He certainly looks like an Arthur Smith running back, right? 17 touchdowns in 2022, which is just absurd. And I always have room on my roster for guys that score touchdowns. That's just me personally. But, I don't think he's a guy that's going to break the bank either. I think he's in line for a raise, but $4 million a year, for a team like the Falcons, that's not a big salary to give out. So they could afford to pay someone like a Jamal Williams a good running back 2 salary like that. Samaje Perine's a similar case, a backup, in Cincinnati. I think he's continued to impress. I think last year was sort of, efficiency-wise, not his best season, but overall, I think he's had a good career in Cincinnati, and would offer some good versatile ability as a guy who can catch the ball, as a guy who can run and be that sort of reliable running back too. The one I might be most interested in, though, is Alexander Mattison from the Vikings, as a guy who's never really gotten an opportunity to be the starter behind Dalvin Cook. He has had to fill in regularly because Cook has dealt with his own injuries. But Mattison, I think, is a really good sort of buy low guy who I think in the right situation like Atlanta could be a really dynamic guy and have sort of a Tyler Allgeier breakout sort of season if he's given the opportunity. Not really a big pass catcher. He's fine in that regard. But, I do really like Mattison as a guy who's probably not going to demand a lot of money. Doesn't have a lot of carries, just 400 carries over 4 seasons so far. So he's only 25, so this is a guy that's still very much in the prime. So Mattison is probably my top guy that I would like to add. I think he does add some of that dynamic ability. Again, hasn't necessarily been the most efficient runner every year, but the Minnesota offensive line has routinely been quite poor, and really demanded the running back make a lot of plays. So we'll see if that pans out. But again, you're not necessarily breaking the bank for a guy like Mattison either. And honestly, I think Spotrac had his estimated salary at like $2 million, and if it's that cheap, like, I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't at least throw the money at him and see. But I sort of expect that he'll have a few suitors, given that, I think people know about him, and I think you'll probably have to raise that salary up a little bit to close the deal. But I do really like the idea of Madison here. Jerick McKinnon, a little bit on the older side, right? But did have a very nice season with the Chiefs as their sort of passing down specialist. And that's something that I think the Falcons are lacking a little bit. That dynamic pass catching ability. He was one of their top receivers, right? I mean, McKinnon had 56 catches for 512 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. That's really incredible. I would love to get that sort of talent in Atlanta to really flesh out that part of the running back room. Maybe Avery Williams can do it. We haven't seen it yet. So Allgeier certainly can catch the ball, but that dynamic speed, that sort of change of pace guy, I think, I still think that Jerick McKinnon can do that. He's not ever going to be the best runner, but I think he's serviceable in that area. He's not going to be a negative when he carries the football, but more of a passing down specialist there. Darrell Williams, another former Chief, right? Went to the Cardinals and, didn't have a ton of carries, but very efficient season. 4.9 yards per carry on 21 carries, similar to a guy like Avery Williams, right? I've always liked Williams. He does have that sort of Arthur Smith build, 220, like 6 foot, whatever. And again, as a guy that's probably going to be, minimal salary, I'd bring him in for sure as a depth piece, similar to like a Damian Williams type of guy. He's someone who can catch the football well, someone who could run, do a little bit of everything, and would be a reliable depth piece there. And then you get to Raheem Mostert, who, despite his good season, his salary is estimated to be quite low according to Spotrac, and that's probably because he's going to be entering his age 31 season, and the guy really struggles to stay healthy, although he did a better job of that certainly in 2022. But, is anyone willing to give significant money to Mostert given his injury history and, his age? But he would certainly be that guy that would bring that dynamic speed element to the Falcons. I would certainly, we know how good of a fit he is in this type of system. We've seen it time and time again. Coming off his most productive season with, 891 yards at 4.9 yards per carry. He's a good receiver too. So I really like the Mostert idea, especially if he's at this price, as a guy that can do a lot for you, can bring sort of that different element to the Falcons' run game. This is also a position, this isn't really a draft show, but it's sort of a position where you could see the Falcons invest a draft pick. There's been a lot of talk about Bijan, and we'll get to that, later. We've talked about it on the live show. But I think, as a potential day 3 target, there's always good running backs on day 3. They're going to be the most affordable way to get running back depth as well. This team has shown a knack for finding those type of guys, like this coaching staff. So I would not be shocked at all if they take another shot on somebody on day 3, or as an undrafted free agency, bring in some guys, and maybe that's all they need. They don't really need to spend significant money on the position. So that's something to monitor. But I do think that despite the presence of Tyler Allgeier and Cordarrelle Patterson here, I do think that there's a need until Caleb Huntley is back for depth. I think at a position where you're constantly sort of looking to get the most value, the best way to do that is by bringing in young running backs and sort of, working them in and out of your rotation. And, I think that's the way to go here. I would continue to do that, whether that's, on day 3 in undrafted free agency, or signing some of these, mid-range running backs. But in terms of like paying a Saquon Barkley, I'm not really into that. Josh Jacobs, not really into that. Montgomery, no thank you. It's just too much money to tie up when you already have a starter. And, the same argument could apply to Bijan, right? The thing with Bijan is like, if you're taking him that early in the draft, the contract is not necessarily tiny either. It's not huge. Certainly it's not going to be close to sort of matching the price of, I think it's like $4 million or something like that. The first year, the second year, it would be 5.3, third year, 6.3, and then fourth year, 7.4. So if you're getting the best running back in the NFL, it's still a bargain. It's not as much of a bargain as getting a guy, on day 3 where they're making they're not making over $1 million for a year or two or whatever it might be. So, it's interesting. It's an interesting strategy discussion. And there's a lot of benefits, I think, one way or the other. But, ultimately at the end of the day, this is a position where the Falcons do need to improve the depth, need to get somebody in here. But they have a lot of flexibility to do that. And with their cap being so massive, they don't need to shy away from paying one of these like good mid-range NFL veteran running backs to really just solidify the room, and then you don't need to spend the pick. Maybe you go looking in undrafted free agency that doesn't cost you anything. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope it was interesting for you. We'll be tackling tight end next, and then moving on to the trenches after that. So stay tuned for that next week. But until then, guys, I appreciate you tuning in to the Falcoholic Podcast. If you don't mind leaving us that 5-star review if you're listening to the audio, like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're interested in supporting the show, getting access to some exclusive perks, including our next patron Q&A session coming on Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern, you can sign up for the Patreon, patreon.com/Falcoholic ad-free early access to all podcast episodes and those exclusive Q&A sessions as well. So you can hit that up if you're interested. And also check out the Discord as well, the link to which is going to be in the show description, as well as in the little scrolling thing here if you're watching on video. A lot of great discussion going in there all the time. We got over 500 members now. So if you're just itching to talk Falcons at any hour of the day, there's always going to be someone in there, I guarantee it, to talk Falcons too. So, or with, whichever your preference is. But again, guys, I'm Kevin Knight at Falcoholic Kevin. Check out the site, thefalcoholic.com, for all that terrific content. And it is still the Falcoholic Podcast for another month. So, hey, enjoy it while it lasts, right? Guys, thank you so much for watching, listening. We'll see you next time on the Falcoholic Podcast. Have a great day, folks.